Good evening. How's everybody doing? It's great to be learning with you. I don't like that sound. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Sunday evening? Yehud in South Carolina, Bill in mid-Missouri, Karen in Northern California, Nancy says, I was ready tonight, ta-da! Patrice in Utah, Stephen in New Hampshire, Mark in Columbia, Maryland, Paula saying Shabbat Shalom, Bella in Florida, and I'm so glad you're here, Paula in the Great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota, John in Maine. It skipped on me. John in Maine, Melissa in Great Neck, Jeffrey in North Carolina, Franco from Trieste, Italy, Peggy wishing us a happy Tu B'Shvat. Yes! And night has fallen here in LA. So we are now in a special day, the 15th of the month of Shvat. So it's Tu B'Shvat. Why does that matter? So Tu B'Shvat, right? Just like Tu B'Av. It's a tes vav, right? When you say 15, you might have thought that it is yud hey. Yud is 10, hey is 5. But because yud and hey are both letters that are in God's name, instead, when we count using Hebrew letters for 15, instead of saying 10 and 5, we say 9 and 6, right? So tes vav, and that's how we end up with 2, right? If you actually pronounce that, it would be 2. So Tu B'Av, Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of the month of Shvat. When we studied Tractate Rosh Hashanah, we learned that there are 4 Rosh Hashanahs, 4 days that are the first day of the year. This is one of them that the sages decreed. This is the new year for the trees. Why is that important? For a couple of reasons. If you're talking about Orla, which means that under halacha, Jewish law, Torah law, a tree, we are not allowed to use its fruit, to eat its fruit until the tree is in its 4th year. Does a farmer remember when he planted every particular tree? No. So on this day, all trees become 1 year older in the Holy Land, and that's because the rainy season starts around Sukkot, and around this time of year, the earliest fruit-bearing trees are bearing fruit. And so all the trees become a year older on this date, and that matters for Orla and also for Meiser. In certain years of the Shemitah cycle, you need to know whether a fruit came off a tree and whether it's considered last year's produce or this year's produce because you tithe it differently in certain years of the Shemitah cycle. This is the birthday of the trees. And so normally there's a desire that you celebrate this day by eating the fruit of the trees that characterize the land of Israel. So this includes dates, figs, pomegranates, olives, etc. And so I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on that. Happy Tu B'Shvat. Okay, who else is with us today? Bill is in mid-Missouri, and Paula says amen, and John says shalom. And over there on the YouTube side, Yitzhak checking in from Kansas City, and Gwen, welcome to our home. Also, tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by our own Bella Rubin, in loving memory of my husband, Boris Rubin. May Boris's soul have a great elevation. May the neshama have a great aliyah in the world of souls. Bella, thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. We truly appreciate it. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. If you would like to dedicate an episode of AT Daily, Nina will put the link in the comments, but it's easy to remember, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. And we're running our annual campaign a little late, but much needed. So we certainly appreciate everyone who supports our nonprofit. Okay, where are we holding? We are in Tractate Nazir, the 17th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of nazirus, becoming a nazir, one who vows to consecrate himself or herself by taking on these extra restrictions will not consume any product of the vine, the grapevine, no wine, etc. Not cut the hair, not become impure for the dead, and pledging to bring the offerings of a Nazir when the term of nazirus ends. We picked this up, we're in chapter 2, tonight beginning with Mishna number 7 of chapter 2. We picked this up at the bottom of page 12b. Our daf tonight, our page is page 13. So Mishna number 7. If one said, and we're generally discussing how one becomes a Nazir, if he speaks a little bit unclearly, a little bit ambiguously, did he become a Nazir or not? We're studying a bunch of cases like this. So Mishna number 7, if a person said, I am hereby a Nazir when I will have a son, and then a son was born to him, so he is a Nazir. He set a condition. He doesn't become a Nazir immediately. He wants to become a Nazir when he has a son. So then he has a son, and he becomes a Nazir. No surprise. If a daughter, a tumtum, or an androgynos, which we would translate as a hermaphrodite, is born to him, he is not a Nazir, since a son was not born to him. You might have said, well, okay, I get if a girl is born, right? If a daughter is born, he didn't have a son. What are these other two cases, the tumtum and the androgynos, translated hermaphrodite? You'll see that in the Talmud, there are 4 genders, right? There's male, there's female, then there's the tumtum, where the genitalia is covered by a flap of skin, and so they don't know what the gender is. And then there's the hermaphrodite, which is an individual who has the sex organs of both sexes. These are obviously extremely rare cases, but they happen. And the Talmud will actually discuss these cases quite often. I mean, not that it comes up every day, but in a sense more often than is represented in the population. Why? Because the Gemara, the sages, are always interested in these liminal cases. These cases that butt right up against the sort of legal limit, right? Like testing what happens in a legal situation when you have these unusual cases. And so, although it happens very rarely, sort of out in the wild, in the real world, here in the books, it comes up more often than you would expect because it becomes an interesting legal question. So, as you might expect, this guy said, I'll become a Nazir when I have a son. If he has a son, he becomes a Nazir. If he has a daughter, or if he has a tumtum, or if he has an androgynos, he is not a Nazir. And in those other 2 cases, the tumtum or the androgynos, you might actually be a little surprised by that, because if we're going to be stringent in matters of written Torah law, you could say, well, the tumtum might be a male. The androgynos has aspects of a male. And so maybe he should become a Nazir, but here the sages are saying, we don't consider a tumtum or an androgynos to be a male. They consider them to be its own gender. And so this guy who said, I become a Nazir if I have a son, does not become a Nazir if he's one of those types of children is born to him. However, if this person says, I am hereby a Nazir when I will have a child, well then, if he has a daughter or a tumtum or a hermaphrodite or a son, in all these cases, he is a Nazir. Not surprising. However, if his wife miscarried, so then he is not a Nazir. Okay, well that makes sense. Even if he says, when I will have a child, then his wife tragically miscarries, well, why would he become a Nazir, right? Presumably this is the first child for the couple. She had a miscarriage, so they did not have a child. Why would he become a Nazir? But Rabbi Shimon says, since it is possible that the child was viable, in which case his vow of nazirus takes effect, he should say the following. And this is a case where he might have had a child. And then in the notes they explain that what Rabbi Shimon is saying is that, well, maybe the child was a living child, but somehow there was an accident in the actual process of childbirth. And so even though the child, died right after the birth was finished, He might have had a child, if only for a very short time, and therefore he should become a Nazir. But since he can't be sure whether he had a child or not, Rabbi Shimon says that this man should say, well, if the child was viable in terms of its development, but it died due to other causes, so I am hereby an obligatory Nazir in fulfillment of my vow. And in case it was not a viable child, I never really had a child that was born, so then I am hereby a voluntary Nazir. And then he proceeds to observe nazirus. So just to sort of cover his bases, because he might have become a Nazir, but he's not sure, he says, okay, well, if I had a child, I will fulfill my obligation to become a Nazir. And if I didn't have a child, then I'm becoming a Nazir anyway, just as a volunteer, as it were. So if subsequent to this, his wife gave birth again, now for sure, whether the original birth resulted in a viable child or not, and they couldn't be sure, especially with the limitations of medicine in the ancient world. So then when his wife does give birth in a subsequent pregnancy, so now he has a child, for sure. So he is a Nazir, for sure. Now, whether he became a Nazir the first time out of obligation or the second time out of obligation, he's going to cover his bases. So Rabbi Shimon says, when this second pregnancy results in a living child, he must now accept upon himself an additional Nazirus. So he should say, if the first child was viable, then my Nazirus for the first child was obligatory, and now this second Nazirus is voluntary. But if the first child was not a viable child, then now I'm having my child for the first time, and now I'm fulfilling my original vow to become a Nazir when I will have a child. So this is my obligatory Nazirus. Since he can't be sure which is which, he covers his bases by becoming a Nazir twice. Now the Gemara. With regard to the statement of the Mishnah, that one who vowed to be a Nazir when a son is born to him is a Nazir when his son is born, the Gemara asks, what is the purpose of stating this ruling? Of course he is a Nazir. He said, when I will have a son, I will be a Nazir. He had a son. Why does the Mishnah need to tell us that he then becomes a Nazir? So the Gemara answers, the law is stated due to the latter clause, the secondary clause of the Mishnah, which states that if a daughter or a tumtum or a hermaphrodite are born to him, that he is not a Nazir. So the Gemara questions this too. Well, isn't that obvious? He specified a son. Why would I think that he would become a Nazir when he didn't have a son, but he had, either a female child or a tumtum or a hermaphrodite? And the Gemara answers, it is necessary lest you say he did not literally mean a son, but rather he meant to say, when I will be built up by means of any child, including the types listed. And the Mishnah therefore teaches us that this is not the case, right? He might have meant when he said, when I will have a son, he might have meant when I will have a child, and he just used the word son to stand in for all children. But since that's not what he said, since he said a son, okay, so he only becomes an obligatory Nazir, has to fulfill that vow when there's an actual son and not one of the other three genders. So the Mishnah also taught, and if the man said, when I have a child, so he didn't specify gender, well, then even if he has a daughter, a tumtum, or a hermaphrodite, his vow takes effect. And the Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that this is the case? And the Gemara answers, it is necessary to state this, lest you say that we require a child of the kind that is considered by people. Meaning, I apologize if this sounds harsh or triggering, but what the Gemara is saying, that you might have thought that when he said, when I will have a child, that he meant either male or female, and therefore if it's one of these very, very rare cases, the tumtum or the hermaphrodite, that, then that wouldn't trigger his Nazirus, because that's not what people normally mean when they say, when I will have a child. That's an unexpected occurrence. But the Gemara says, no, that's not how we hold. Rather, we hold that whatever the gender is, male, female, tumtum, or androgynous, if he has a child, and he said, when I have a child, I'll become a Nazir, so he becomes a Nazir. New subject. The Mishnah taught that if his wife miscarried, he is not a Nazir, even though it may have been a viable child. So the Gemara clarifies, according to whose opinion is this taught? And the Gemara answers, it is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, remember, we heard Rabbi Shimon mentioned in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda are often kind of, argument partners, dispute partners, debate partners. Especially on the laws of Shabbos, but also here they're going to be brought in. So we mentioned Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah, now the Gemara is bringing in Rabbi Yehuda. So the Mishnah taught that if his wife miscarried, he is not a Nazir, even though it may have been a viable child. So the Gemara clarifies, according to whose opinion is this taught? It is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, what? Rabbi Yehuda didn't talk in this Mishnah. But we're bringing in Rabbi Yehuda's opinion on a different body of law that we're going to apply here. So Rabbi Yehuda, with regard to a heap of wheat, what? Rabbi Yehuda holds that if one vows to be a Nazir, if a heap of wheat contains a certain volume of wheat, and it is unclear whether or not the condition was fulfilled, so Rabbi Yehuda would rule leniently. It's possible that there was enough wheat in the pile to trigger the vow of nazirus, but we don't know and we cannot know. In that situation, Rabbi Yehuda would be lenient and say, we're not going to force you to become a Nazir. We don't know if your condition was fulfilled. It might have been, but Rabbi Yehuda is going to be lenient. Now that's a surprise because becoming a Nazir is by Torah law, and in cases of uncertainty, normally we rule stringently. Why does Rabbi Yehuda rule this way? Rabbi Yehuda, with regard to a heap, Rabbi Yehuda rules that if one said he will be a Nazir, if a certain heap contains 100 core of wheat, and it was stolen or lost before it could be examined, preventing him from checking whether the condition was fulfilled, in this case, he is not a Nazir. And the reason is either because the law is ruled leniently in questions of nazirus, or because he holds that people do not state conditions that may result in them being left in a state of uncertainty. So that's interesting, right? So Rabbi Yehuda would sort of dissolve this vow on the premise of he wouldn't have taken a vow if he knew he was going to be left in a state of uncertainty. And so the vow is sort of auto-dissolved, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Now, the Mishnah further taught that Rabbi Shimon says that the individual should say, well, if the fetus was viable, if the child was viable in terms of its development, but it died due to other causes, so then there was a child, and so I'm an obligatory Nazir to fulfill my vow. But if the child was not viable, so he never had a child, he's going to become a voluntary Nazir to cover his bases. Now, the Gemara relates that Rabbi Abba inquired of Rav Huna, if one said, I am hereby a Nazir when I will have a son, and his wife miscarried, and he separated an offering for his Nazirus, but he did not sacrifice it, and his wife gave birth again to a son, what is the law with regard to the offering that he separated? And the Gemara asks, well, okay, in accordance with whose opinion did Rabbi Abba pose this question? If he asked it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, what dilemma is he raising? Didn't Rabbi Shimon say, in a case of uncertainty with regard to Nazirus, the ruling is to be stringent, right? This is tracking. Rabbi Shimon is stringent. Rabbi Yehuda is lenient. So Rabbi Shimon says we got to be stringent, since he might have become an obligatory Nazir because the child might have been a viable child, and so he became a parent, and his condition was fulfilled, he should take on Nazirus. But since it's possible that the child wasn't viable, so he takes on the Nazirus anyway, and he's not sure whether he's doing it to fulfill his vow or just to be a voluntary Nazir. And then when the wife has another child, God willing, then he's going to take on Nazirus again, and now his bases are fully covered. He's not sure whether he was a voluntary Nazir after the first pregnancy or after the second, but in any case, he's covered for the vow. So, here too, since the child might have been viable, he was required to separate the offerings, right? Remember that when you become a Nazir, you're going to have to bring offerings at the end of your Nazirus, assuming that the temple is standing. Now, you don't have to separate those offerings until it's time to bring them, but you could opt to separate them early on because you know you're going to need to bring it later. What does it mean to separate offerings? It means that you consecrated those offerings, the animal or the birds or the meal or whatever the actual content of the offering is. When you set aside the bird or the animal or the wheat, whatever you're going to bring as that offering, whatever the requirements are, now you've consecrated it, and now it can only be used as the offerings of a Nazir, and probably only as the offerings for you when you complete your nazirus. So, if he separated it but never brought it because he wasn't sure if he had a child or not, and then later she gets pregnant again, and now he definitely has a child, can he use, and so now he has to become a Nazir because he made that vow. So can he use those offerings that he separated after the first uncertain situation, whether he became a parent or not, and whether he became an obligatory Nazir or not? Can he use the offerings he separated then in fulfillment of the offerings needed at the completion of his Nazirus after the second pregnancy, when he for sure was obligated to become a Nazir? So here too, since the child might have been viable, he was required to separate the offerings after she miscarried. He may not use those offerings for the Nazirus brought about by this later birth. Rather, one should say that the question was in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the lenient one, who said that in the case of uncertainty with regard to Nazirus, the ruling is to be lenient. So the question is like this. What is the law in such a situation? Are the offerings already considered consecrated and need not be consecrated again, or are they not consecrated and therefore he must consecrate them a second time? So the Gemara asks, what difference is there? In any case, he is certainly obligated to observe Nazirus now, and he must separate the offerings. So the Gemara answers, the question is referring to the issue of its shearing and its labor. Meaning, if they are considered consecrated from the time of the initial consecration, and you're bringing a sheep, for example, it is prohibited to shear their wool and use them for labor like any other consecrated animal. But if they never actually became consecrated after the first time because of the miscarriage, then it is permitted to shear the animal and use its wool, and you're going to consecrate it again later. No answer was found for this question, so the Gemara concludes that the dilemma shall stand unresolved. Teiku. New subject. With regard to one who accepted Nazirus upon himself, that would begin upon the birth of his son, the sage Ben Rechumi inquired of the sage Abaye and asked, if one said, I am hereby a Nazir when I will have a son, and another person heard him and said, and it is incumbent upon me, right? Like, and I also will be obligated. So what is the law with regard to the second person? You see the question that's being asked. One guy said, I will be a Nazir when I will have a son. Now we've been discussing what happens to that guy. Okay, but we get a pretty clear idea that if he then has a son, he has to become a Nazir. This other person heard the first guy say, I will become a Nazir when I will have a son. And the second person says, and it is incumbent upon me also. What did that second person just vow? Did he say, if you have a son, I too will become a Nazir? Or did that second person say, like you, when I have a son, then I will become a Nazir? That's the question being asked, right? What is the law? Is the implication of the second person's statement a concurrence to the statement of the first one, which would mean that he too accepts Nazirus upon himself when that first guy would have a son? Or is the implication of his statement meant to be about himself, meaning that when he, the second person, has his own son, then he also will become a Nazir like the first guy? So the Gemara develops this question further. Even if you say that the phrase, quote, and it is incumbent upon me, has the implication of meaning that it is to be understood about himself, meaning like we're gonna learn out from his statement that what he meant to say was, what you said, that sounds like a good idea to me, so I'm now saying when I have a son, I will become a Nazir. Even if we learn it that way, what is the law if one said, I am hereby a Nazir when I will have a son, and another heard him and said, and I. So now we're distinguishing what the second person, if he says, and it is incumbent upon me, versus if the second person said simply, and I, right? So is he saying, same question, did he say, and I will become a Nazir when you have a son? Or did he say, and I will become a Nazir when I have a son? Same question. So what is the meaning of the second person's statement? Is it to be understood that here too he is speaking of himself, meaning I shall be a Nazir when I will have a son of my own? Or perhaps this is what he is saying. I love you. He's saying that the friend is saying that to the first guy. I love you as you love yourself. I would be as happy as you at the birth of your son, and I too will be a Nazir when you have a son. Ben Rechumi continues, if you say that anything he says to another in front of him, now we're on 13b, should be understood in light of the fact that the matter is embarrassing for him, so the second person is likely to mean that he will become a Nazir upon the birth of a child to the first person, as he will be embarrassed to seem indifferent about the birth of the child to the person standing before him, right? If I said, man, I want a son so bad, I'll become a Nazir when I have a son. And so the friend listening to that says, wow, I will also be moved. I will be happy for you when you have a son. And that's all he's saying. And I too will be happy for you. He's not pledging to become a Nazir necessarily. So then the following question arises. If one said, the first guy, I am hereby Nazir when so-and-so will have a son, and another heard, and I, what is the law? Do we say that since the second person did not vow in front of the subject of the first person's vow, he therefore speaks of himself when he says, and I, meaning that he will be a Nazir when he himself has a son? Or perhaps this is what he's saying. I also love that guy. You're saying you're going to be a Nazir when that guy has a son? I love him too. I'll also become a Nazir when he has a son. As in the previous cases, no answer was found for this question, and the dilemma remains unresolved. Is it unresolved? The law became like this. If one says to another person, I am hereby a Nazir when I have a son, and the other heard him and said, and I, well then the second person is not a Nazir, since he only meant that he loves him and wishes for him to have a son. And that's how Rambam, Maimonides, learns out this passage. Very interesting. Right? It almost like the Gemara says that the two choices are when the second guy says, and I, he meant either, when you have a son, I'll become a Nazir also, or when I have a son, I'll become a Nazir. But Rambam says, no, you misunderstood this whole passage. When the first guy says, when I have a son, I will become a Nazir, that's clear. And then the second guy, when he says, and I, all he was trying to say is, I'll be really happy for you. He's not pledging to become a Nazir. And that actually became the law. Now we go to a new Mishnah, Mishnah number 8, here in chapter 2. In a case where one said, I am hereby a Nazir now, and I will be a Nazir when I will have a son. Okay, so now this guy is right away taking on two terms of Nazirus. He's saying, I'll become a Nazir now, and I'll be a Nazir when I have a son. Right? So he's saying, I'm becoming a Nazir right now. He didn't say how long, so it's a 30-day Nazirus. And he's also pledging that when he will have a son, he will become a Nazir again. Okay. So then he became a Nazir immediately, so he begins counting his own term of Nazirus, the first vow. But before his term of Nazirus ends, his wife gives birth to a son. So what does he do then? What does he do is he first completes his own, and afterward, in the middle of his Nazirus period, a son is born to him. So he first completes his own initial term of Nazirus, and afterward, he counts the term of the Nazirus he vowed on the condition of the birth of the son. Right? So if he says, I'm a Nazir now, and I will be a Nazir when I will have a son, and then he has a son while his first term of Nazirus is still running, what does he do? He completes that first term of Nazirus, and then he adds another term of Nazirus to fulfill the vow that he said, I'll be a Nazir when I have a son. Now, what that means is there's two separate terms. So when he completes the first term, he shaves his hair, he brings the offerings to the temple, and then he starts a new period of nazirus, and he's going to have to do the same thing at the end, shave and bring the offerings at the end of the second term. However, if he changed the order of his statements, and he said, I am hereby a nazir when I will have a son, and I am hereby a nazir now. So he begins counting his own term of nazirus. And afterward, during this period, the son is born to him. So at that point, he sets aside his own term of nazirus and counts that which he vowed on condition of the birth of his son. And afterward, he completes his term of nazirus. Right? Because he said first, I'll be a nazir when I have a son. And then he said, I'm a nazir right now. So the vow that he said first takes precedence. He doesn't have a son right now. So then when he said, I will hereby a nazir, he becomes a nazir right away. But then the son is born to him, and that was the vow he uttered first. So what he does is he interrupts the count. He says, I got 10 days down on the initial nazirus, but now he has a son, so he counts the 30 days for becoming a nazir when the son is born. And then he goes back and completes the uncounted, the missing days of the first term of nazirus. That's the Mishnah. Gemara, in light of the ruling of the Mishnah, Rava asks, if one said, I am hereby a nazir for a standard term of 30 days and will begin observing it after 20 days, and I am also a nazir from now for 100 days, what is the law? Should one say that since these 100 days of nazirus are not completed within those first 20 days, it could be said that the 100 days of nazirus do not take effect at all until after he has completed the 30-day nazirus? Or perhaps, since he still has at least 30 days of hair growth at the end, as after the 30-day term he could observe an additional 80 days, therefore the 100 days of nazirus take effect from now. And he counts 20 days, pauses to observe the other term of nazirus for 30 days, shaves, and then completes the final 80 days of the long term of nazirus. And the Gemara asks, and let him raise this dilemma with regard to a short term of nazirus when fewer than 30 days would remain if he suspended the first term of nazirus in order to observe the other. And the Gemara answers, he raises one dilemma as a result of the other. In other words, Rava's question was an outgrowth of a different inquiry, which in turn led to this question. So the full discussion goes like this. We're at the top of 14a. We might as well finish this subject. So if you say that when he accepts nazirus upon himself after 20 days, and then he vows a short term of nazirus of 30 days starting now, then since if he pauses from his first term of nazirus after 20 days, it is only 10 days that are left over to complete after the second term of nazirus, that those 10 should not be reckoned for him to complete a full term of nazirus. 10 days are insufficient for hair growth. Therefore, he must observe a full 30-day term of nazirus after the second term of nazirus, which means he is not a nazir for the first 20 days. With that assumption in mind, the question arose, certainly if he vows to be a nazir for 100 days, since he has a further 80 days at the end, which is sufficient time for his hair to grow, do the first 20 days count for him as part of the 100 days or not? So the inquiry leads to yet another question, and if you say that the first days of nazirus take effect, and his term of nazirus will be completed in the 80 days after the second term of nazirus, then if he said, I am hereby a nazir after 20 days, and from now I am a permanent nazir, what is the law? Does the permanent nazirus take effect for him during those 20 days or not? We're getting kind of complicated, but remember that what we're actually saying is, if you take a vow, two vows at the same time, and you can't just run them concurrent because they were conditional vows, and the second vow kicked in the middle of the first vow, what are we going to do about it? And what if the first vow was a short one and the second one was a longer one? And then, after he finishes that second one, which interrupted the first vow, and he goes back and he has to complete and then he shaves at the end of that second term. Now he has to go back and complete the first term. But the first term has less than 30 days remaining for him to fulfill that term. And the reason that a term of nazirus that is not defined is a minimum of 30 days, right? Like if you don't say how long, it's going to be 30 days, and all nazirus has to be at least 30 days. Why? Because you can't shave for 30 days and then you do. And so you have to have enough hair for it to seem like, you observe that condition that you observe that aspect of the law of nazirus, that you let your hair grow. So that's minimum 30 days. So if this term that interrupted the first term, when it ends, he shaves, now he's going to go back and complete the first term, but there's less than 30 days in it, maybe we should require this guy to observe a full 30-day term to complete his first one, even though he already observed some of the days of that first term. Since permanent nazirus is, and now we're adding the wrinkle of what if one of the terms is permanent nazirus, right? You're going to be a nazir forever, and you interrupted a term of nazirus to become a permanent nazir. So how can you ever go back and complete the first term? Now, if you say here with regard to cases of a standard permanent nazirus, after 20 days, since it is possible to request a halakhic authority to dissolve the vow, which would result in the first term of nazirus taking full effect, it therefore takes effect during those 20 days. So then the following question arises. If one said, I am hereby a nazir like Samson, right? Samson was a lifelong nazir. After 20 days, and from now I am a nazir without specification. So what is the law then? So since here it is not possible to request a halakhic authority to dissolve the vow of nazirus like Samson, and there is no way of completing the first term of nazirus, does the first nazirus take effect or not? And the Gemara adds yet another question. If one said, I am hereby like Moses on the 7th of Adar, what is the law? Is this considered an expression of nazirus, in that just as Moses passed away on that day and he drank no more wine, so too the speaker vows to be a nazir? Alternatively, perhaps this phrase does not indicate the acceptance of nazirus. And the Gemara comments, look, at least resolve the first of these questions. You're multiplying questions and not answering them. Let's answer one of these questions. Let's answer the first question. As it's stated explicitly in the Tosefta, if one says, I am hereby a nazir after 20 days, and I am hereby a nazir from now for 100 days, so he counts 20 days of his term of nazirus immediately, after which he counts 30 days for the subsequent term of nazirus, and afterwards he counts 80 days in order to complete his first term of nazirus. Listen. If the temple should be rebuilt in our lifetime, may it be today with the coming of Mashiach, and then you want to undertake nazirus, please, for God's sake, make one vow at a time and speak clearly of what the vow is that you're undertaking. Okay, let's check comments or questions. On Nazir 13. Bill, is the short answer to all this, vows aren't the best idea and concurrent vows are an especially bad idea? Just so. Sharon, I know this sounds trivial, but is it possible for a person who is bald ever to be a nazir? Or does their biological condition rule this out? It's interesting. They talk about shaving. The word often used is shave. So I'm thinking like, and a woman can be a nazir too, by the way. So maybe the fact, like for instance, somebody who has alopecia, right, where they just have no hair on their head, but they still, will usually have body hair. And so maybe you solve it that way. Or maybe, if it's physically impossible, it's a great question. If it's physically impossible for you to grow hair anywhere on your body, does that mean you cannot become a nazir at all? Or that you simply observe all the other requirements of nazirus, including bringing the offerings at the end, but you don't have the possibility of shaving your head? Or maybe even, you run the razor over your body even though no hair is coming off. Maybe then you fulfill the requirement. I don't know the answer. Now, it's funny because when we're learning Torah Lishma, right? We're learning Torah for the sake of learning Torah, which is a magnificent mitzvah, right? We're fulfilling a tremendous commandment. When we're learning for the sake of learning, It's spectacular. It's beautiful. Every time we gather together and learn, especially when we're learning things that don't really have practical significance for us, it's only because we love God and we want to fulfill our obligation to learn Torah and know about God. And by the way, right, learning about God and what God wants from us, that's incumbent on all people, not just Jews, right? To know God is the first of the Noahide commandments. So learning about God and what God expects from us, I think always fulfills a requirement for everybody. Having said that, I was just reading Duties of the Heart, and I'm just spacing for a moment on the name of the author of that beautiful book, Duties of the Heart, which many rabbis talk about the importance of this book, written by Bachya ibn Pekuda, right? Chovos halevavos, right? Chovos halevavos, Duties of the Heart. And I was just reading the introduction to that book on Shabbos, and somebody asked, like, he was quoting some sage. He didn't say who, but there was some great sage, incredibly learned, who was asked a very difficult, abstruse question about the laws of divorce. And, divorce obviously has great practical significance, but, when we read Gittin, Tractate Gittin, there's all these like super weird cases where, like, in order for a man and woman who are married to become divorced, he has to give her a get, right? Like, he has to give her the bill of divorce. What constitutes giving? And so there's all these crazy questions about, like, if a bird, like, grabs the get and is flying over her house and drops the get, and it lands on the fence that separates her backyard from her neighbor's yard. Are these people divorced? Did she actually receive the get or not? Questions like that. And so about such a question, and like a further technicality on a technicality, right? The sage who was asked, I'm sure, wasn't just asked about something that it says in the Gemara, but like a really weird hypothetical that is an extrapolation of what's in the Gemara, etc. The sage said to the person asking, I have been learning Torah for 35 years, and I don't waste any time. I learn 20 hours a day. And I have access to all the books. This particular sage had, like, the biggest library in the region where he lived. And he says, and in all that time, I've been working so hard to fulfill the duties of the heart that I haven't had time to encounter this question that you're asking me. And I suggest that you spend more time on the duties of the heart. Now, what was he talking about? I am in no way saying that we shouldn't be asking these kinds of questions. But I'm just bringing down what Bachya ibn Pekuda is citing this wise man in saying, what are the duties of the heart? Meaning Torah knowledge, right? Studying Torah with the end in mind of refining one's character, right? What are the lessons that we learn when we're learning? And I'm sure he wouldn't say, so therefore skip parts of the Talmud. You should learn the entire Talmud, because learning the Talmud, does refine the character. It's like you just don't have to go too far afield into weird esoterica. Because what we all have an obligation to do, and we should be pursuing this in kind of organized, thoughtful manner, is becoming a more refined human being. Kinder, wiser, more charitable, less prone to become angry, less prone to be ungrateful, more attached to God, etc. Those are the duties of the heart that Bachya ibn Pekuda is talking about. And we should at all times be aspiring to become that finer human being that we have a vision of ourselves to become. Recently, we had a very, very, I'm not going to go into the details at all, but I'll just say we had a very challenging event happen, in our lives with respect to work on a project. And it was infuriating, horrific. Somebody did us wrong. And, I was just so angry. But I kept asking myself, okay, but there's got to be a lesson that I should learn here about my own behavior. I can't say that I'm the most perfect person in the world. What can I learn? And in the midst of my fury, I couldn't see it. But when I, calmed down a little and continued to ask that question, one thing that came to me is, an improvement that I can make in my own life. In my case, waste less time. How is that tied to what this person did to us? I'm not going to go into the details. My point is, we should always be asking the question, what can we learn that will make us a more refined human being? When we're reading a Torah portion, when we're learning Talmud, just always have that question in the back of your mind. What can I learn from this that will make me a finer human being and more of a blessing to the people in my life? To ask that question is eventually to discover answers to that question. That's what I have for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night, 6 p.m. Pacific.